So now that I have a little bit of volume or some basic objects inside my desk scene, I want to start to think about the environment and the lighting. And before I start to light this thing, it's always a good idea when it comes to lighting, once we start playing with global illumination and some other details, it's really important to take into account the fact that when we look at light inside an environment, it's not just casting a light in a specific direction like this desk lamp is, but you're also going to get reflected light and light bouncing off of different scenes to help, or different objects to help contribute to the overall illumination of the scene. And so in order to get a better feel for what's going on here, I'm going to create a cube, and this cube is going to act as my floor object. I'm going to make this object much bigger. So I'm just going to key in some values for the X and the Z here. And what I want to do is just start to think about this desk sitting inside a room. That maybe feels a little big. Basically what I want to do is just rough out a basic environment. I can always make another pass at this later. But I have this floor object, and I'm just going to make sure that the desk is sitting on the floor here. Definitely want to stay organized, so I'll call this floor. I'm going to borrow the floor. I'll copy and paste, and I'll call this wall. And I could just change the values of the Y, but I think what I'll do is just to prototype this really quickly is I'll just flip that up and rotate it and get that lined up. I'll do the same thing. I'll copy and paste that wall. I'll call this back wall so that I don't have to figure out which wall's which. And I'll do the same trick here. I'll just kind of rotate that. I'm holding down the shift key to constrain that. And I'll just kind of send that back in space as well. Get a better view here so I can see what's going on. So I'm just rotating around, roughly line that up, and I'll be a little bit more precise about this a little bit later on. But now at least I have some walls inside my scene. My walls are a little too tall, but this'll solve the problem of having an environment. So now when I give that a quick render, I got a couple of issues going on here. My walls are looking pretty boring. I'll solve that in a little bit later. But currently inside my scene, I have this work light scene. This work light, and I'll even call it that. This is just a temporary light to help illuminate my scene while I'm working on it, because if this light were not here, I'm looking at just the illumination of the spotlight. Now, I'll Command Z to undo to get my work light back in the scene, and I'll take that intensity way down so that my primary focus is actually on the desk lamp. I'm going to dig in and find my lamp that's contributing to the illumination here, and I want to find my light object, and I had nested that inside the bell housing object. And with that selected, I'm going to make some real quick decisions. The first thing is I want to warm up this light a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit of color to it, maybe a little bit of orange yellow. Not too much, just a little bit. A little bit of color goes a long way. Now when I render that, the intensity is pretty high, that's good. We created this as a spotlight. I definitely want to turn on shadows, and I'll start with Shadow Map Soft. And already that's helping out quite a bit. I also have the ability to turn on visible light, and visible light's kind of interesting. If I click on visible light, and I'll skip the volumetric and inverse volumetric for now, and I'll just go straight to visible. And if I give that a quick render, what you can see is now we start to see the light cone from this light. So it's the visible light that's inside the scene. It's a real simple effect. If I go back to the light object, you can see that there's a little cone here that represents the visibility of the light, and I can kind of push and pull that around. And as I extend that, the visibility of the light continues to get closer to the table. Now if I look in the Details tab of this light, I can control the inner and the outer angle of the spotlight, and there's little control points in the scene that I can do that as well. I can control how far that cone projects into the environment. So there's a lot of controls that I can play with here, and as I change those values, you can see that it's starting to affect the light. Now if I go into the Visibility tab, we have the ability to control the actual distance of the visibility, and as I play with this value, you can see that the outer distance here I'll just send that visible light out into the scene. That's pretty heavy-handed, but I'll start to play with the values of fall off and edge fall off, and I'll really get these values to start to make a little bit more sense. Now, I'm going to select my light, and I actually want to start to narrow this cone a little bit because I felt like that was kind of too far of a cast. Another thing that's happening is if I take my light and just temporarily I'll kind of sneak it out here. Another thing that's happening is when I render this, because I have visibility turned on, this light goes down to a really sharp point. Not exactly what I want. I want kind of more volume to this light down at the base, and I can really take a deep dive into the details of the light. And if I look through these tabs, if I go into details, what I can do is way down at the bottom there's the near clip and far clip, and what we can do is we can clip the visibility of this light. I'll set near clip, and I'll set that near clip. I'll just kind of play with these values, see if I can get things to move, and there it goes. As I bump up the 2 value of the near clip, I can see that there's in my heads up display there's a little bit of information that's playing here, and I'll just render this to test it. That didn't give me what I want, so I'll send the to and from. I'll just play with these values, and that's what I'm looking for. As I play with the to and from values, I can start to clip that visible light, and so now there's more volume to this light. Now I'm going to run into a little bit of an issue when I take this lamp light here and I move this back into my object, and I move it as far back as I want so that I can start to see that. I'll just render this, and actually I got lucky and I got away with that. What I was expecting to happen here is that at some point, if I move that, continue to move that that light back, you can see that I'm actually starting to cast through and into. I'm actually looking through the back of the lamp here. There's a little hole when I modeled this. There's a little hole in the back of the lamp. Oops. And my light just happens to be kind of peeking through that hole, and I can start to see the shadow of that. So I got a little bit of a glitch there. I need to fix that, and so I'll just kind of pull that through. And now you may run into an issue where your light gets obscured by your lamp because you move your light so far back into your lamp that it starts to obscure it, and that's what's happening here. And so I'm starting to get some kind of strange results, but I'll just continue to play with that and make sure that that lamp is sitting inside. That looks pretty good. Now I'll adjust that near and far clip, or I'll adjust the near clip in this case to get that light sitting back up inside my lamp the way that I expect it to. Now I'll start to play with things like the fall off of the light, and if I set this to a linear fall off, or if I set this to something more complicated like inverse square fall off, the effect of the light starts to fall off the farther you get away from the lamp. So there's a lot of details that we can play with. We can continue to play with the visibility and kind of affect the color as it falls off. We could actually spend an entire project just looking at probably the details of some of these lights. If I go into the shadow tab, I want to point out that inside the shadow tab we can control the color of shadows. By default, these shadows are showing up black, and more accurately they're probably going to be kind of a really dark blue, and that'll contribute a little bit of contrast to the overall lighting scheme. So, and we can adjust the resolution of the shadows that are being cast in this case because we're using shadow maps. Now remember, if I go back into my light and I go way back into the general tab when we first started, we set our shadows to shadow map soft, and that way if I go into the shadow tab, the shadow map is set to 250 pixels wide, and if I bump that up, the sampling size, I'll just increase that. It'll start to really affect the detail and resolution of the shadow. So we can continue to play with some of these values, but already I'm starting to get a much more dynamic scene. If I wanted to emulate a light bulb up in my lamp, because remember, if we were to look up in this lamp and you know, we were to see up, and obviously I still got a little bit of a glitch with my visibility on my light. It's really heavy, and I'll continue to play with that with some of these variables offline. But if I want to see a light bulb up in here, what I could do is I'll just emulate this with a sphere very quickly. I could take an object like a sphere, and I'll create a new material. And this material, I'll give it a little bit of yellow or a little bit of orange. So So I'll go into the yellow here. And what I'll do is I'll turn on luminance. Okay. And the luminance, I'll set that to a little bit of yellow, a little yellow-white. Now, when we turn on the luminance channel of a material, it's actually contributing to the luminance of the scene, particularly when we turn on global illumination. So I have luminance turned on, that way this object's not receiving as much of a shadow. And if I turn on the glow, and I'll select that glow channel, and I could play with the inner and the outer strength and take some of these values down so we can start to see what's going on. We can turn off use material color and play with different colors of the glow. And we can get some really kind of interesting results here. So if I want to model something that should actually be visibly seen that looks like a light bulb, I can take a material like that and I'll just cheat and drag it and drop it onto the sphere object. Now when I render that, you can see how that object could start to look like a light bulb. Just zoom in a little bit closer. You can see the glow taking effect, the luminance, and so I'll just take that sphere and I'll just stick that up inside my lamp object. Now I'm going to run into a little bit of a glitch when I do that because you'll see that it's cutting off the illumination of the object, and of course my light bulb's enormous as well. Because that sphere is a physical object and it's interfering with the light that's being cast inside my scene, what I need to do, and even though this is the wrong size, I'll call this bulb. And ultimately, I'll integrate this into the hierarchy of my lamp. But what I need to do now is I need this bulb to be ignored by the light. So it's casting a shadow and it's interfering with the illumination of the scene. What I can do is if I select the light that's casting and I go to the project tab of the light, inside the project tab, we can manually exclude objects from the effects of this light, or we could manually, if we wanted to, we could manually include. And this is a really great way to isolate a light source and say, okay, I really want this light only to affect a building or a character, and I don't want it to contribute to the overall illumination of the scene. Or we can tell it to completely ignore an object, and in this case, what I want is I want this light that I have selected, to exclude. And down here we have an object list, and what I'll do is I'll just drag my bulb object into the list of objects that it should exclude from the scene. And so now when I render it, you can see that it's completely ignoring that object, so it's illuminating the scene and I'm getting my cast shadows again. If I select that bulb and hit the delete key, I've removed it from the list, and now if I render it again, I'll show you the contrast. So the shadow that's being cast here is actually from that bulb object that we just created. And I'll drag that with that light selected in the project tab with the exclude, the mode exclude chosen. I'll drag any object into that list that I want that light to ignore, and that's a really quick and easy way to get that light to ignore a specific object inside the scene. So obviously I have some issues with scale, and as I'm looking at the base of this light, it feels a little flimsy and I want something more substantial. But I'm really kind of just focusing on the environment and the scene. What I'm going to do is I'll probably throw a real quick, simple, flat texture on my environment, my floor, my walls. I'll also knock a hole in this wall so that I can create a window, and I'll create some effects with some lights coming in from outside as well. I'll start to take a look at some of those in the next presentation.